Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Sustainability and Transport Overview and Sustainability Committee for the 21st of September. For the of anybody watching on the web cast, we could introduce ourselves to the wider public. I'm Conrad Chaman, Chair of the Sustainability and Transport Overview and Sustainability Committee. I represent the Social Eco Award.
Hello, my name is Amelia Murray. I am the Overview and Scrutiny Manager covering the Sustainability and Transport Committee.
I'm Councillor David Barker, covering Bramley Seath Ward and Deputy Chair of this committee.
Councillor Miranda Perks, Williams Airport.
Stephen Arnold, Head of Clean Air Zone for Birmingham City Council.
Councillor Martin Brooks, Harborne Ward.
Councillor Hall Green South Ward.
Councillor Richard Parkin, Sutton Ready Cap Ward.
Seeing Bailey's question. So.
Thank you. It's a reminder to all members present here and the opposition that this meeting is being live streamed on the internet for live and subsequent broadcast. So please can we keep this in mind and when we are speaking. And the press and the public can record statements, photographs if they wish to, except when there are exempt items. Item 2 on the agenda, apologies. Are there any apologies? Yeah, I have a point from Councillor Alex Aikens. Here. Declaration of interest.
Yes, I forgot, although I don't sit on the Bus Alliance as a formal member, I am the substitute member for Andy Street, the elected mayor, so I think I should probably declare.
Thank you. And since last meeting, I myself have been appointed as the vice chair of the combined authority, Western Combined Authority Transport Subcommittee. Item 4 is notes of the last meeting. Can I have your agreement that the correct record of our meeting?
Agreed.
Okay. Any matters outside?
Well, I flagged this up to the scene beforehand, but on page 7 of 24, I requested a list of all schools that have signed up to the air quality monitoring and not the CFSS.
Yeah, I've sent you a response, Councillor.
Yes.
As I outlined, Steve, I'll be covering that and air quality monitoring and CFS.
Yes, but in the
And
minutes.
it's been updated,
Yes.
which I've sent to you as well.
Which you have.
Anything else? No. This will be action point, action notes.
The action plan.
Delivery here, not on the agenda.
It's part of the action, so it's separate item with the action plan.
It should be separate on me and after these.
They're part of the payment.
Okay. I know there are two actions raised by Councillor Huxtable. One I think will be responded to by the Honourable later on. There's another one I think is going to be answered by Phil Edwards. And the response is we reply to Councillor Huxtable. But I would say that if something raised in the meeting, all the members should get the response.
Yeah, that could be circulated. I'll forward what I've sent to Council.
Unless it's specific to the ward matter, which is not straight for anybody else. But if it's a violation, factors, then every member needs to know.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, item 6 is the clean air zone update report, and I would like to welcome Steve Arnold, head of clean air zone, who will come and join us today. Before you went to Steve, members raised a number of queries related to clean air zone. And I know that you have put together a presentation that we will go through, covering some of the key areas highlighted previously. Steve will also be covering the issues raised by by members, that's all outlined the excellent Director Geography I referred to earlier, by Councillor Untitled. Can I hand over to you, Steve?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me today. So before I start, just my apologies for anybody who's seen some of this material before, because I know that I've spoken to a number of people in the room around this topic on a number of occasions. But I just thought it would be really useful just to go back to how we started, what was the specific reason for the introduction of the Clean Air Zone, the background as to how we got to where we got to with the Clean Air Zone, how that fits within a broader framework for England and the rest of the UK in terms of adoptions of similar sorts of schemes, where we're up to really in terms of the operation of the zone, how we believe that it's starting to have an impact in terms of not only compliance, so that's a reduction in the percentage of the most polluting vehicles on the road entering the zone, but also how that is starting to, or appears to be starting to, lead to reductions in the levels of nitrogen dioxide, which is the primary objective of the scheme. And also then talk a little bit more about the allocation of revenues that have been generated from the Clean Air Zone, provide an update on that, confirm the allocations, and also, as per Councillor Huxtable's question, provide some more detail around exactly what that money is being spent on, and ideally over what sort of time period. Hopefully that covers enough, but obviously there'll be time for questions. Okay. So before I start, is there any immediate questions before I start?
Any questions?
No? Okay, right. So. Right, so the purpose of the Clean, as I said at the beginning, the primary objective of the Clean Air Zone is to address the levels of nitrogen oxide within the city. We identified through a number of surveys and from the government's own collection of data, a high number of exceedances, locations where we have levels of the air pollution, nitrogen dioxide, which is above the legal limit. So the legal limit is 40 micrograms per cubic meter. And the reason that it's important that we do something about it is that nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter and air pollution in general contributes to at least 1,000 early deaths in Birmingham and anywhere between 24 to 36,000 deaths across England and the UK. Those are numbers from Public Health England, as it was called previously. It's also important to note that poor air quality is linked to a number of chronic health conditions such as heart disease, diabetes, asthma, and a range of other things. And increasingly, the body of evidence around the link between air pollution and these kinds of diseases and the impacts that it has on people is growing day by day. Only a couple of weeks ago, there was some new research published, I think it was through The Guardian, talking about the role that air pollution has in terms of triggering cancers in people. So again, that body of evidence is growing day by day. The other really critical thing with this is that children in high pollution areas are 4 times more likely to have reduced lung function, and poor air quality disproportionately affects the deprived and the vulnerable. And for a city like Birmingham, we have a high number of communities with high level of deprivation. So it's important that the city tackles this public health issue. And Public Health England have described poor air quality as the single biggest environmental risk to public health. So again, it's really, really critical that something's done about this. And around about 80% of all roadside nitrogen dioxide comes from road transport, and 40% of the roadside NOx is from diesel cars. So there is a clear and identifiable source for this problem, and the Clean Air Zone has been designed as a way of addressing that source of that problem. But getting to the launch of the Clean Air Zone in 2021 really started back in 1995 with the last Environment Act, which introduced the requirement for all local authorities to annually review air quality. And in 2003, the council identified that the annual mean for nitrogen oxide would likely to be exceeded after the target date of 2010. We published a local air quality plan in 2006. In 2011, the updated air quality action plan included a reference to a low emission zone. So the discussions around some kind of intervention, some kind of policy intervention, some kind of action to tackle this issue has been on the cards for quite some time. But it's really only in the last few years where that activity around this has accelerated. Some of that has been driven by the legal challenges to the government. Client Earth took the government to court 3 times and won. In terms of its the actions that it was taken around to enforce the limits around nitrogen dioxide, and in turn the government placed a ministerial direction on Birmingham, 4 other cities in December 2017. That list grew to 20 to 60 cities that were given ministerial directions to take action. And in 2019, when the full business case for the clean air zone was approved by the government, there was a second ministerial direction placed upon the council to deliver that plan as it was approved. And there was funding, as well that was provided by the government to support the delivery of that. There was also a policy framework to support the implementation of the clean air zone. So it's whilst it feels relatively recent, the implementation of this, there has been a long build up to that in terms of building up the body of evidence to demonstrate that this is a significant issue that needs to be addressed, but also the policy tools to enable the action to take place. It's also important to remember that each of the authorities or the cities that have been placed within ministerial direction have addressed the issue in slightly different ways. Birmingham is one of several cities that felt that a clean air zone is the only way to achieve the objective of reducing the levels of nitrogen dioxide in the shortest possible time. That is the really, really critical thing within the ministerial direction that the government placed upon Birmingham. It is to take action in the shortest possible time. And the approval of the business case was on the basis that the plan was brought by ourselves and also by the other cities that are introducing clean air zones, is that this is the only way that that change will be achieved in the shortest possible time. Other cities with fewer areas of exceedances have been able to take other measures, but again, the driver for all of this is about taking action in the shortest possible time, and that itself has been informed by the court case that the government lost when it was taken to court by Client Earth. The judge in that case said, you need to address this problem, you need to reduce the risk of human exposure, and you need to do so in the shortest possible time, and that's then flowed through into everything else. So whilst the Clean Air Zone framework is a policy framework produced by the government, and there's a range of funding there to support the implementation of that, we're not the only one introducing Clean Air Zone, as you can see from this map. York's introduced a non-charging Clean Air Zone because there's 2 types of Clean Air Zones within the framework: the non-charging Clean Air Zone versus a chargeable Clean Air Zone. The overwhelming majority of cities introducing schemes are going for a chargeable scheme, because it helps drive behaviour change. The schemes that are already alive, Bath, ourselves, and Portsmouth. Portsmouth's gone for a Type B, Bath have gone for a Type C, and with a chargeable clean air zone, there are 4 grades of clean air zones, and they start from A and go up to D. A is the least range of vehicles that are included. D is the greatest range of vehicles. So D includes everything up to passenger vehicles. A is based on heavy goods vehicles. So there's a range of gradation there. And again, that is all based upon an understanding what is driving the local issues in terms of that levels of nitrogen dioxide, and then what schemes, what measures need to be implemented to create that change. It's also important to remember that other cities and areas are introducing similar but slightly different schemes because they're there to do slightly different things. So London has had its ULEZ since April 2019. That expanded in October 2021. And as you're probably aware, they're looking to expand that even further to draw in an even greater area to improve air quality across the whole of the city. In Scotland, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee and Aberdeen are in the process of introducing low emission zones. Again, very similar in terms of operation, slightly different objectives. And Oxford has introduced a zero emission zone, very, very small part of the city centre. It's already stated that it plans to expand that at some point, but again, it's a similar type of scheme, slightly different objective that it's trying to achieve. But in terms of general operation, that's the way it's worked. And across Europe, there are at least 250 cities that have introduced similar sort of schemes in the low emission, zero emission, or clean air zone as a way of tackling and improving air quality. Birmingham scheme went live on the 1st of June 2021, became operation. It's an area that covers the inside of the A4540 middleway. As I said before, it's a type D clean air zone, so it includes all categories of vehicles. The only one it doesn't include is motorbikes. There's a daily charge that applies 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year. That's £8 for cars, taxis and vans, £50 for HGVs, coaches and buses. The level at which the pricing was set is set within a range that's provided by the government to the clean air zone authorities as part of the public consultation that the council will run in preparation for the introduction of clean air zone. They'll go out and ask questions about what sort of level that pricing should be. There's also modelling that takes place to try and determine at what price point change will take place. For the council, it's a combination of modelling that took place, the price point that we believe would be required, and also the feedback that we got from the public consultation. We've set the pricing at the lower end of the scale. If you compare that with the likes of London and Jules, will be a different scheme, as I said before. Their daily charge is £12.50 for cars, taxis and vans. In Bath, their daily charge for HGVs, coaches and buses is £150. It's £9 for vans. But again, that's all based upon local modelling to address a specific challenge and the feedback from the consultation. At this point, it's also probably important to remember the kind of scale that we're dealing with the clean air zone in terms of the numbers of vehicles travelling through. In the period sort of June through to March of 22, there were estimated to be just under 30 million vehicles, individual vehicles that travel through the zone. That's not journeys, that's just individual vehicles. Around about 3.8 million of those were potentially subject to the daily fee. That doesn't take into account any exemptions and things like that were in place. There were around about 5.5 million searches on the online vehicle checker. We had 3.2 million visits to the Brumbury's website. So there's a significant scale in terms of reach and the level of operation. And it's an operation that's done in combination between the council and the DVLA, who provide central services to the council and all other local authorities. Those central services are the online vehicle checker, the payment platform, and also a central contact centre who deal with inquiries around results from the vehicle checker, and they take payments over the telephone as well. And we pay the government for all those services, and it's around about £2 per transaction. So it's a significant sum of money, but again, the volumes that we're dealing with recognise the kind of support and the infrastructure that's required for this. It was also felt that from an efficiency perspective, providing some of these central services to all clean air zone authorities is probably the most efficient way of delivering those IT projects rather than individual authorities with their own vehicle checkers or payment platforms. Well, that's interesting. I'm not sure quite why that's looking like that, but that doesn't look like that on your slide. No. No. Okay. That's doesn't look like that on my screen. So the next few slides just run through some of the numbers that we capture. We publish on a monthly basis data through the Brumbury's website. So that's at brumburys.co.uk/CAS data. So every month we'll publish some high-level operational data around volumes of vehicles, how the rates of compliance are changing, how that breaks down in terms of the categories of vehicles. We also publish data around the number of PCNs issued. That kind of high-level data is really important to us to try and provide that transparency. So what this graph is showing is the average unique vehicles per day in any given month. As you can see, it's cyclical. In the period up until November of last year, the volume, the average volume per day was growing. The moment at which the government reintroduced sort of the instruction to work from home from the 13th of December, we saw the volume of vehicles entering the zone drop off overnight. And that's reflected there in the figures for December. January is usually a low month anyway, in terms of volumes within the city, but then there's that recovery. But again, it is cyclical. And as you can see, we've also included the data for June, July for this year, just as a comparison against last year to see how those fare. So June this year was slightly down than June previous year. However, July for this year was slightly up on July last year. So it's really too early to draw too many, to make too much speculations as to what that actually means. But what we know longer term, year on year, is that generally the trend of vehicle volume, vehicle journeys within the city centre is downwards, and that's year on year. So at least 5 to 6 years worth of data. What this next slide is attempting to show is the any potential changes between traffic coming into the city centre versus traffic using the ring road. What we've been able to do here through the traffic flow data is you clearly identify the impacts of the first lockdown and the second lockdown, which had a much less reduced reduction in terms of vehicle volumes, and then the CAS launch. Again, there was no significant reduction in terms of those vehicle volumes coming into the city centre per se. The final chart, what that's attempting to look at is the changes between the volumes of vehicles coming into the city centre versus those using the ring road. What this shows, which is quite difficult to see in this graph, but what it does show is that whilst there was a reduction in the volume of traffic entering the CAS immediately after its launch, there was no significant change in terms of data using the ring road. So this stage, we don't believe there has been a displacement of polluting traffic to the ring road. Again, we continue to monitor that, but that's what the data is suggesting at the moment. We're going through the process of completing, this is all based on the 6-month interim report on the clean air zone. We're in the process of preparing a 12-month report, so looking at the data for the full 12 months of operation. This next slide looks at the changes in the percentage of compliant versus non-compliant vehicles entering the clean air zone. What we've done for June is averaged out the change between the first 2 weeks and the second 2 weeks of the month, because we paused payments during the first 2 weeks to allow a bit more time to prepare for the clean air zone, submitting an application for exemption. And what we did actually see from the point at which payments, the zone became operational and payments started, enforcement started mid-December. At the start of the month, we were at just over 18% non-compliant vehicles entering the zone. The moment we started enforcement, it went down to 12%. So there was that significant change just with the introduction of the enforcement process. But over time, what we've seen is that steady reduction. So for June, the average for the month was 15.2% non-compliant vehicles entering the zone. For July, that figure is now at 7.8%. So that is almost half in the space of a year. Whilst the vehicle volumes have more or less stayed the same in the same period of time. So that, again, suggests that the clean air zone has helped to accelerate that process of improving the fleet entering the clean air zone. What this next slide does is looks at the overall composition of the fleet, but then breaks it down into the individual categories, and then also looks at the rates of compliance. And what we're also looking at within this chart is what we had modelled compliance, what we would need as a rate of compliance within each of the vehicle categories to start to achieve compliance with the legal limit for nitrogen dioxide. The red line indicates where we modelled compliance would be if we did nothing. And that's really, I think that's probably the most significant thing with these slides. So to go from the top left, around about 88% of all the vehicles that enter the zone are passenger cars. The next biggest category is vans at around about 9 to 10%. For passenger cars, they're now at about 92.5% compliant, which is really good progress. And as you can see from the red line, we modelled compliance if we did nothing for 22 would be significantly lower. For LGVs and vans, that the position there has started to improve significantly in the last few months in terms of the rates of compliance. I think the most significant one for us was really with the HGVs, coaches and buses. While they only comprise probably around about 2% of all the vehicle movements or vehicles entering the zone, we modelled that compliance in a do-nothing scenario would be around the 60% mark. From the data we've got, we're at around about 90%, consistently around about 96% for HGVs. For coaches and buses, it's more or less 99% consistently. So a lot of that is down to the good work of National Express West Midlands, who committed very early on to only having compliant vehicles operating in the clean air zone. But what we're starting to see now from some of the air quality data, and I'll come to that in a second, is that in certain locations, whilst there may still be compliant buses operating in those areas, there are other environmental factors that are coming to play. I mean, with some additional actions may be required in those locations. The other thing that we did as part of the introduction of the clean air zone was ensure that there was a broad range of support. So that's exemptions from the daily fee and also financial support. In terms of the exemptions, there are local temporary exemptions that are put in place, and those are primarily for people who live within the clean air zone. There are people who are on low incomes working in the clean air zone, commercial vehicles that are based in the clean air zone, and also the permanent exemption that was put in place was one for community use vehicles. And as you can see from these numbers, for residents, there are around about 3,000 exemptions that are in place, and we're going through a renewals process with them at the moment because that's a 2-year exemption. For workers in the CAS, there were around about 6,000 exemptions. That exemption has now ended, and for commercial vehicles based in the clean air zone, there are around about 530 in total. And that represents a monetary benefit to the people that have these exemptions. As a rough calculation, the total benefit potentially to residents and workers and commercial business is in the region of around about £24 million. That's on the basis that during that period, they've not had to pay the daily fee. So it's either the £8 or the £50 fee. And if you work it on the basis of 3 to 5 days a week and so on and so forth, you get to a figure around about 24 million financial benefit to those groups. For workers in the clean air zone, they now have the opportunity to apply to a scrappage and mobility credit scheme. And we've seen a reasonable uptake for that. And there's also financial support that's available for the taxi community. And what this slide is showing is the green line is the overall rate of compliance within the taxi fleet, Birmingham licensed taxi fleet. So that's private hire and also hackney carriages. So that's at around about 90% now from its starting point of 36%. The private hire fleet is the most compliant at about 95%. So that's better than the general passenger fleet at the moment. The hackney carriage fleet we've seen significant change in a relatively short period of time, but it's still at about 54%. That represents 300 vehicles of the hackney carriage fleet. Similarly, for the private hire fleet, we're down to around about 300 vehicles. So we're now starting to talk about very, very focused conversations with those drivers. My team will start to be going out, especially to taxi ranks and things like that, and talking to the individual drivers about, reminding them about the financial support that's there to either to get them to retrofit a vehicle, get to a zero emissions vehicle, or get a Euro 6 compliant vehicle, because we want to try and get to as close as possible to 100%. Not only because is it good for air quality, but it's also means those vehicles are newer and they're also likely to be more fuel efficient as well. So that there are some added benefits there. The additional thing we've done around the introduction of the clean air zone was an extensive marketing campaign at the launch. what this slide is showing is just the latest version of that marketing campaign, which we rolled out as part of the general support around the Commonwealth Games. We're very keen to remind anybody who did drive into the area that the clean air zone was in operation. That's in addition to the 300 plus signs that are out on the routes into the clean air zone and also on the boundaries. So it was a mixture of digital billboards and screens at locations around the area. We also had posters within all of the car parks within the clean air zone, Birmingham City Council owned and commercial. We had advertising on the most popular navigation app ways, and there was social media and sorts of things. And we're still analysing the data around that, but we believe that's had a really positive impact. Not least with the Waze advertising. One of the stats we've seen from that is that there are around about 84,000 potential drivers who could see the message because they can identify where those people are going their routes, and around about 70,000 of those people were served engaged with the advertising. That means it was on their screen for 4 seconds or more. So yeah, there's some quite interesting data that's coming out of that. But as I said before, the single-minded purpose, single-minded objective with the clean air zone is to reduce the levels of nitrogen oxide to within the legal limit. So this is the data from the 6-month report. And what we're seeing when we compare 2021 to 2019 is that within the clean air zone, on average, there was a 13% reduction in levels of nitrogen oxide. That was across 37 monitoring locations. That's more monitoring locations that we have in place than what we had in 2016, which is where the original data comes from that was used for the modelling for the clean air zone. And what we're starting to do is narrow down onto a handful of locations within the zone itself and also on the ring road where we continue to have exceedances. Some of those are very, very close to the legal limit. Some of those are in excess. So, for instance, Cars Lane in the city centre is at 53 at the moment. The legal limit is 40. So we are going to be we've already started some work with the University of Birmingham, WA Air, to better understand what are the sources of the pollution in those locations. Are there any other environmental factors that could be causing that pollution to build in those areas? And we're going to be doing our own source apportionment surveys as well to understand, is it buses, is it taxis, is it passenger cars, those sorts of things. Cars Lane, it's buses. That they go through there. That area is a canyon in terms of the buildings. So we need to think about how we tackle that. But like I said before, we're starting to narrow down on a very, very small number of locations now in terms of where we continue to have exceedances.
Steve, what is in the pink? What was the percentage in the pink? The positive?
Yeah. So what we've done, just to be completely transparent here, is we've looked at 2016, which was the year that we used for baseline data within the modelling for the business case. So we've done a comparison between 2021 and 2016. We've also undertaken a comparison between 2019, which we've used as the baseline year for measuring change, because it is the last normal year, if you like, pre-COVID. So we've compared that to 2020, which was a COVID year, so traffic volumes were significantly reduced anyway. The column in red is a comparison between 2020 and 2020, so a COVID year with a partial COVID year and the introduction of. So again, we're trying to be completely transparent in terms of how you cut and compare that data. Yeah. So if you compare the data from 21 with 2020, there is a marginal increase, and that is purely because of the moving out of COVID, when you had a naturally low volume of traffic in the area. I think in the first lockdown, traffic volume was reduced by around about 70% in the city, so quite significant. That answer that question?
No, I think I mean, the figures in the last column in the pink are positive figures. 2%, 4%, 3%. I mean, so what drive these figures, or I mean, what these figures means?
Okay, so that 2%, 4%, 3% is an average increase in the levels of nitrogen dioxide across those 37 monitoring locations within the clean air zone. I think it's 15 monitoring locations on the ring road, about another 7, I think, across the wider city. So those percentages show an average increase because we're comparing the COVID year, where there was abnormally low volumes of traffic, with 2021, when those volumes were recovering. So you would assume that there would be an increase anyway.
This is for the COVID-19 lockdown.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Well, if we were to ask questions to that slide, if you could just go back.
Yeah, sure.
If I'm reading this correctly, between 2016 and 2019, air quality in the clean air zone increased or decreased, as it were, got better by some 27%, i.e. you take 15 away from 42. And in the wider city, air quality in terms of nitrogen dioxide improved by 22%.
No, I don't think you could do that without actually looking at the data. It's not a straight take 15 away from 42.
Okay, explain then.
Okay, so the way in which the data is collected across 90 plus locations across the city. Yeah. So each and every month, the data is collected, it's assessed, and then you get an average across the year. So it doesn't naturally. So it's not a linear. You go from say 10% this year to minus 20% in 2 years' time. So the in-between point is 15% or whatever. It's not straight this minus that to get this number, because it may have been higher. The change may have been higher. It may have been lower.
Can you provide data for 2016 to 2019? Because there could be an indication that the clean air zone was having an effect before the clean air zone came into effect. In other words, the natural progression towards cleaner vehicles was already having an impact, and could have actually achieved a significant reduction in the levels of nitrogen dioxide before clean air zone was introduced.
Yeah, there's a couple of things to note with the data for 2016. There were far fewer monitoring locations, and they were at locations with greater exceedances. So any changes will tend to be greater, not necessarily, but have tended to be greater in those locations. That's the first thing. But you're absolutely right. There has been a natural improvement in the fleet over time anyway.
As you'd expect.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll make no bones about that. What the clean air zone has done is accelerate that rate of change.
If I may ask, if you look at the numbers in each column, they're remarkably similar. The clean air zone doesn't appear to be an awful lot better than the wider city.
Yeah, no, I think Councillor Huxtable asked me this question last time.
I did, and I was going to ask you to. But Councillor Green beat me to it.
No, and it is remarkably similar. And I've looked at the data several times since, and I think part of it is to do with the number of monitoring locations that we've got and the way in which it averages out. Because within the data, there are certain locations where the improvement is greater or lesser and that kind of thing. So that's where you get the average. It does, I admit, it does look odd and remarkably convenient that it is consistent across the board. But I'm more than happy to share the data. We've published annual air quality status reports through the environmental services team. All that data has to go to DEFRA. It's all validated and all those sorts of things. So I'm more than happy to share all of the data.
Okay. But you're saying that the clean air zone has made an effect over and above the changes to the fleet.
So the clean air zone has helped to accelerate change in the fleet, which appears, and I'm very cautious, appears to have contributed to the reduction in the levels of nitrogen dioxide. I don't want to get carried away saying, yeah, the clean air zone has done this thing. It's strongly suggestive, but there may be other factors at play. Yeah.
Take either on this slide or something else. Otherwise, you can. That's the completely.
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. So the next part of this really is that the clean air zone is just part of what we are starting to do and rapidly expand our thinking around how we take the benefits of clean air zone in the city centre out to the whole of the city. I think when I talk about the clean air strategy, it's important to put this in the context of the statutory requirements that the City Council has anyway. We have a statutory requirement as part of the local air quality management requirement we've got to produce a local air quality plan, and it gets updated every few years. What that does is that specifically looks at locations where we have historical exceedances or we are modelled to have exceedances of a particular pollutant. So it focuses on potential areas of concern. What the clean air strategy is trying to do is to take a whole city view. So it broadens out the scope of the air quality, of the local air quality plan. In terms of the priorities, we've set out 5 high-level priorities. 3 of those are focused on the fleet in general, in terms of improving the flow, improving the fleet in general. So that's trying to maintain that change in terms of compliance. Improve the flow of the fleet, because it's important that tackling congestion is seen as part of the longer-term objective around this as well, but also significantly reducing the following. We don't just want to convert slightly less polluting vehicles into even slightly less polluting vehicles. We need, and this is encapsulated within the transport plan for the city, a complete shift in terms of how the city moves. Everything historically has been built around the movement of vehicles around the city, and the A38 through the city centre is a clear example of how that thinking was put into play. But we need to think more about the movement of people rather than cars around the city, and that's where things like mass transit systems and all those sorts of things start to come into play. As part of this as well, we're also looking at reducing the sources of pollution and exposure, broadening out the scope of what we're looking at beyond nitrogen dioxide, thinking of things that may be coming other pollutants of concern, like particulate matter. That's not something that's specifically of concern within the local air quality action plan at the moment, because we're not above the legal limit. However, we are conscious of potential changes that could be coming our way through the Environment Bill. And also the World Health Organization themselves have said there are no safe limits of air pollution. So we are trying to think about that. But also as well, through the Clean Air Strategy, through the Clean Air Plan and the Transport Plan, other associated schemes, we are also thinking about how we empower behaviour change. So there's a handful of pledges that we've put forward as part of this first iteration of the strategy, and I'm absolutely clear this is just the first iteration. This needs to develop, this needs to grow, this needs to be more bold, which we like to talk about at the moment. So critically, we need collaboration. This isn't something the council can do on its own. Within the Clean Air strategy, we've recognised what the council can do on its own, and we've highlighted those things. But also, we need collaboration with other city stakeholders to try and make those changes possible, because this is a whole system change. The other pledge is around clean air for schools, so I'll talk a little bit about where we're up to with the rollout of air quality monitors to schools, but also importantly how that sits within a broader wrap in terms of building engagement, but also offering solutions to schools where they've identified a particular issue or want to make a broader change. Inclusivity and protecting the vulnerable, absolutely critical, because that goes back to one of the original issues highlighted at the beginning of the presentation. Planning for the future, how we build in the benefits of clean air into the City for the Future vision. Also, clean air zone for the city centre, which is one of the things we're doing, and importantly, measuring success, using the data that we've got, sharing that data with partners like the University of Birmingham, UCB we're working with as well, in terms of helping us to gain more insight from the data, working with Transport for West Midlands, sharing data where we can and things like that. So it's really important that we measure that success and then share wherever we can.
Team, our questions from confidence.
Sorry, just to clarify one point for me. You mentioned the Environment Bill. As I understand it, it got royal assent last year, so it's the Environment Act. So we now know quite clearly what the legislative prescribes in the Environment Act as what we have to do, rather than a bill which can be amended or not even get to the royal assent stage. Is my understanding correct?
Yes.
Right.
So, however, what I would add to that is that there has been a consultation. So one of the elements of the bill, the Act, was that the government would bring forward updated legal limits around nitrogen oxide, particulate matter, and those sorts of things. So there's been an extensive consultation around that. Those new limits have not been passed yet. We have a reasonable understanding of what there could be, and what some of the other obligations might be on local authorities and the combined authority as part of that. But yeah, those haven't been through yet. So, okay. So one of the pledges we've made is around clean air for schools. So what we've committed to is rolling out air quality monitors to all schools, or at least making the offer of an air quality monitor to all schools. The phase one of that is to provide an air quality monitor to a school in every ward of the city. So far, we've got to 51 schools out of the 69 that we targeted, and those green dots indicate where those schools are across the city. So there's a good geographical spread. And the data that is coming from those sensors is already being shared through our partners website, which is included on there. When those air quality monitors are rolled out to each of those schools, there's a lot of information that we provide to the school, information sheets, those sorts of things, so they can share those with parents, so they completely understand what they are looking for. Our aim is to deploy the remaining sensors by the autumn half term. At the moment, none of those sensors have indicated exceedance for nitrogen dioxide, PM10 or PM2.5. The next phase of the scheme, which is to then expand that program and make the offer to every single school in the city, has been supported with an allocation from cash revenues. So there's around about £1 million to support that. That was agreed with Cabinet in March of this year. And it's a project that's being delivered between the Clean Air Zone team, the Environmental Services team, because they provide technical expertise with this, and also the public health teams and the travel demand teams, because it's a multifaceted piece of work where we've got engagement with schools, we've got the public health aspect, and then the collection of data. What we're doing as part of that program is part of the wrap around that is ensuring that there's as much educational resources that are available. And initially, that's targeting primary school children, and we're working with the University of Birmingham to develop that suite of resources as well. And then through the travel demand team, what we're also looking to do is provide those solutions. So things like more safe school streets, membership stars, and those sorts of things. So it's not only the ability to capture the data and then show that data, but also to generate conversations around what the sources of the air pollution potentially are, and how people can take actions to address it, but then also think about what the school and parents can do and the communities can do to address some of those challenges. What this next slide shows is the schools where safe school streets have been rolled out, the wards, and what we've also done is looked at where those schools also have an air quality centre, because there is a correlation. We are trying to match those up as much as possible. I believe that was one of the questions you asked, Axel. So the next few slides, what they really do is start to look at, so the Clean Air Zone provides a relatively short-term benefit in terms of improving the compliance of the fleet, accelerating compliance of the fleet, helping to reduce the reductions in the levels of nitrogen dioxide. Longer term, the revenues generated from the scheme have to be reinvested in transport-related strategies and policy. The legislation used to create the scheme specifies that any revenues, any net surplus revenues generated have to be reinvested in transport-related strategies and policies. So what this slide is showing is those allocations that have already been approved through Cabinet. With the gap funding for the pilot of the hydrogen buses, so that was supporting the purchase of 20 hydrogen buses, that money's already been paid out. And this money will only be paid out at the point at which we have the money in the bank. So we're not forward paying money out if we don't have it. At the end of the last financial year, we put into reserves around about £15 million to support these allocations. In future years, as that money is provided, those will then be put into reserves to support these, because these are multi-year schemes. I'll talk a little bit more about them in the next slide. The other in total, there's around about £35 million worth of allocations there. The two most recent are the creation of the CAS-funded Transport Environment Programme. So that's 5 programmes of around about £1 million each. One of those is the expansion of the air quality monitoring scheme, and I'll talk a little bit more, provide a little more detail about the others. Create a Clean Air Fund, which is to provide each ward in the city with either £20,000 for a single ward member, £40,000 for 2 ward members, with that budget over 2 years. So it's £20,000 per year, or £40,000 per year. The other 3 projects on that list are combined authority projects or Transport for West Midlands projects. So the upgrade of the University Rail Station, the delivery of the new Camp Hill rail stations, and cross-city bus projects. And the next couple of slides will provide some more detail around that. The other allocation is the city centre pedestrianisation and public realm improvements, phase 1. And that budget is there specifically to support those pedestrianisation measures. Anything to do with the river fountain has been funded through a completely separate Transforming Cities Fund. So just to be absolutely clear before anybody else about that. The other thing as well is that we're also providing support to the expansion of the city's electric vehicle charging point network through the Fast and Rapid network, and then looking at the longer term ambition around the building out a publicly accessible network around 3,600 charging points. So these slides aren't in the pack, but I'll resend this pack because this question came in after I prepared the previous pack. But what this does, this slide runs through, is really the detail that sits behind initially the 3 projects associated with the Combined Authority Transport for West Midlands. So the first one is the University Rail Station. And essentially it's to support mode shift, investing in the infrastructure that encourages more people to use public transport and then encourage mode shift. Some of that benefit, as per the line at the bottom, is long term, 1.8 million by 2040. So this is investing in the long term. This money is likely to be paid out in this financial year. We're already talking to the project team about this. So we're going through the whole grant agreement process. They're having to put in a claim form, they have to get signed off Section 1.5. The critical thing with this is that the money is only being paid out on things that have been delivered. It's not being paid out in advance. So things have to be delivered. We have to see infrastructure in the ground. We want to see the benefits of the money that's being provided to these things. For Camp Hill Station, we expect to start to pay out money for this either probably in the next financial year, probably in the financial year after that. And there's a business case that goes behind this. The cabinet approval for this was the 17th of March 2020, and the funding we're providing from CAS revenues is about 5.2 million out of a scheme that's were expected to be in the region of £52 million. So it's not everything, but it is a reasonable contribution to that specific project. And similarly with the cross-city bus, the contribution that we're making to that is the total project value for cross-city buses around about £24 million. And they're expected to be benefits across the whole of the network, east, west, north, south. And there's 6 different packages that the funding will contribute, and potentially benefits around about 73 million passengers per year. So it is going to be used. So that those were all approved by Cabinet on the 17th of March. They're all part of the same Cabinet paper, and I'm more than happy to share that paper with people who want access to it, because there's a series of appendices as well that provides all the detail that goes behind that. In terms of supporting walking and cycling, so this is the city centre pedestrianisation and public realm improvements. So the allocation here is 8.395 million. That was presented to Cabinet on the 19th of January. I've made note here the decision was called in, so the actual decision was slightly later than that, towards the end of January, just for transparency purposes. And this contribution is purely for phase one of that activity, and as I said, it is being used to support walking and cycling benefits. So some of the deliverables within phase one include the public realm improvements within Victoria Square, around Colwell Row, Waterloo Street, as I said before, the river fountain, although the money that we provide is not going towards that, because that's from the Transforming Cities Fund, and then permanent hostile vehicle mitigation and a variety of other things are part of that phase one package. A lot of that has been put in place in preparation for the Commonwealth Games to improve that. So we expect a call on that revenue in the not too distant future. And the final part of this really, in terms of just providing some more detail around how this money is being used. So this is the most recent allocation that was approved. So this is the Transport Environment Programme. So there's, as I said before, there's 5 sort of areas that this is being intended to support, with a budget of £1 million for each project. So expansion of the car-free school streets, building on the existing 20-mile-per-hour areas delivered in the inner parts of the city, expanding the Birmingham Cycle Revolution, expanding the Big Birmingham Bikes, and as I said before, an expansion of the school's air quality monitoring programme. And as I said before, I'll share all these slides afterwards, so it's got a copy of these and the links to the various cabinet papers that provide all the detail that sits behind those. And I think that's my last word. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience.
Right, open the questions. Okay, confidence. Green.
I'd like to ask, what's the lifespan of the clean air zone? As old vehicles reach the end of their life and as diesel vehicles stop sailing in it, what will happen then?
It's a very good question. So the decision that was taken by Cabinet was to introduce a clean air zone in order to address the ministerial direction that the city had to reduce the levels of nitrogen dioxide to within the legal limit in the shortest possible time. Yeah. So that is a decision taken. At the point at which we achieve success with that plan, we can, in theory, dismantle and decommission the scheme. So the modelling that we had in the original business case suggested that we would start to achieve compliance more or less 2 years after the scheme was introduced.
So another 10 months.
Roughly, yeah. And that was at the point at which all local temporary exemptions fell away in order to help drive that compliance. The other factor within this is that the government has said you need a period of stabilisation to be able to demonstrate that if you remove that scheme, the problem doesn't return. Now, period of stabilisation, anywhere between 2 to 3 years would be my sense at the moment. So that gives you an indicative sort of time scale.
Thank you. Yes. Just starting on the timeline. One, you mentioned National Express and compliance with buses. Of course, we passed the AQPS in 2012, the Air Quality Partnership Scheme, and that was unique, I think, at that point to the Birmingham city centre. Wasn't included in the timeline, but my understanding is that was the start of making air cleaner in terms of emissions from buses, making sure that only buses within a certain Euro rating could actually come within what is now known as the clear air zone. So could you expand any more on the impact of the AQPS and how you see that going forward? Because I thought that was put in place quite specifically to make sure that the polluting vehicles, polluting buses, were cleaned up immediately since the introduction of that zone in 2012. So that's question one. Question two, You said there were 6,073 permits issued for workers in the CA which have now disappeared because the year has ended. Do we know where those 6,073 have gone? Are they still traversing through the clean air zone? Are they using alternative routes in their vehicle? Do we know if there's been a move to behavioural change and public transport? And related to that is when the residents, the 3,027 residence permits, which are for 2 years full, if the clean air zone is still in operation at period of stabilisation, if we've reached compliance, do we know what is likely to happen regarding those? Clean air from schools. I think this is completely non-controversial because as councillors we supported this unanimously in City Council, but no idling zones around schools. I think it was Councillor Paul Tilsley, your ward colleague, who actually introduced the motion. I never hear what we're doing about implementing that City Council motion about no idling around schools. And if we're talking about clean air for schools, why are we not talking? Why are we not talking about it? I'm not seeing any mention of it in any slides that we've had about the clean air strategy or talks about it. In talking about empowering behaviour change, and you talked about look at mass transport systems. The one thing I've always said is let's also look at taking cars away from the city centre by getting them to park where there's public transport and mass rapid transit systems that go into the city centre, whether it's rail, metro, sprint, bus park and rides. But we never actually seem to want to put money, CAZ money, towards those types of schemes that stop the vehicles not just travelling within the CAZ, but on the approach to the CAZ through our arterial road system. And I think you sort of mentioned it, but in terms of our journey to becoming a clean air city, obviously, as you said, the emphasis is on nitrogen dioxide levels. That's the legislation. What are we specifically doing about other air pollutants such as carbon dioxide? You mentioned particulate matter 2.5 and 10 as well. And are we looking at those not just from vehicular emissions, but emissions from other forms of transport? So, for example, along the Snow Hill lines, we have diesel trains. It is entirely a diesel line. There's non-electrification. Obviously, broader issues at play. Working with the train operating companies, working Network Rail. But are we at least making a start? Because you talked about some of the worst air pollution levels from the monitoring being along Moore Street, Queensway, or just off Moore Street, Queensway. Well, of course, Moore Street Station sits adjacent to Moore Street, Queensway. So what are we doing about those? Just a few questions there, Chair.
Okay, Dave, over to you.
Okay, right. So, so the first question was around the impact of the AQPS in 2012. Yes. So yes, I think it'd be fair to say that that has helped to sharpen the minds of the bus operating companies in terms of improving their fleet. And as I said before, we recognise the overall fleet, including buses, were improving over time anyway. What I would also refer you back to is that when we did the modelling back in 2016, 2017 around the do nothing scenario for 2022, the modelling suggested that the rate of compliance would be at 60% for the bus and coach fleet. It is significantly higher than that. So something else, in addition to the AQPS, has happened to accelerate that rate of change. And for a commercial operation like NXWM, it would make business sense to accelerate any sort of change that they were making to their fleet in order to not have to take on any additional charges for operating in their busiest area. So I think it is absolutely fair to say that the AQPS helped to do that. And I also understand in talking to some of my colleagues in the travel policy team that there's discussions already underway about an updated version of that policy in terms of potentially shift towards zero emissions as a longer term objective, because that then supports not only air quality but the reduction in carbon emissions ambitions of the goal. So yeah, AQPS will have had a contribution, but something else has happened to get it beyond that 60%, which we modelled it would be for 2022. The next question was really around behaviour change or impact of the removal of the exemptions for workers and for residents. So for workers, we know that some of them have taken up the scrappage and mobility credit scheme. So that's the offer of £2,000 to scrap a non-compliant vehicle and use that money towards a compliant vehicle through our partner, or to use the £2,000 on a mobility credit. Around about 25% of the people that have successfully applied to the scheme have received a mobility credit, so there is some interest in that. However, not a significant number of people have taken up that scheme, so we haven't tracked what people are doing as an alternative. What I can do, though, is talk about what we're seeing from the resident side of things, because that's a 2-year exemption. As part of that exemption, they are asked to go through a renewal process after the first year. So a number of people haven't renewed for the second year. So we've undertaken a telephone survey with the people that didn't renew. Around about a quarter, 30% of those didn't renew because they've either upgraded, well, the vast majority of them didn't renew that exemption because they've upgraded their vehicles. Some moved out of the area. But I think similarly, we will have seen not necessarily, perhaps more. And one of the things that my team are doing is going back out to those people that had that worker exemption before, just to better understand, well, what have you done since? Is it that you are taking a different journey to it? Is it that you're undertaking public transport? Is it that you've swapped out your vehicle? My sense from the numbers that we're seeing, and based on the rates of compliance and the way in which that's changing, is that more of those people have adopted a more compliant mode of transport. But we need some more data to back that up. That's my sense at the moment. The other question was around no idling zones. Yes, I'm not sure what to say to that, but within the clean air strategy, I'm sure we've made reference to the potential use of no idling zones. It doesn't answer your question, why aren't we doing it? But it is recognised as a potential tool within the clean air strategy. I think that the way in which we're trying to look at this and working with the travel demand team around this is ideally the introduction of safe school streets, so excluding the traffic from those areas is better and a more collaborative, if you like, way of working with parents and local communities rather than trying to enforce something, because going down, knocking on people's doors and handing out fines and warnings and things like that is not necessarily a way to encourage behaviour change. However, it's not something that's been excluded, so I'll take that one away.
All I would say is that if you look at Solihull schools, and because my ward borders onto Solihull, you see what Solihull Council are doing in supplying standard banners, signage to Solihull schools. So that they're taking it forward, not through the way that you think might be counterproductive, and I would agree with you, but trying a different way. So again, we learnt about car-free street schools from Solihull. Is this an opportunity to learn about no idling zones or ways to tackle from Solihull as well?
I would certainly say that as part of the range of solutions that we offer to schools, especially where they're getting an air quality monitor, and you've got that raised level of engagement, that awareness, that the desire to do something about it, they can be offered the resources to do that. But again, a lot of that should be locally led rather than us saying this is what you have to do. The other question that you raised was, I believe, around mass transit.
Parking rights.
Parking rights, basically, yes, thank you. So, yes, it is something. It is a topic that has been discussed before, and I know Phil Edwards has responded to a number of questions about this before. And I think one of the fundamental challenges around that comes to finding suitable land. I think it would be safe. But I think the other thing within this as well is, again, how within the transport plan, there's the segments plan, and the aim of that is to discourage those through journeys as well. So it's not just about park and ride as the only solution. It's about trying to think about this in other ways in terms of getting people to change their perceptions about what that journey through the city should be, and offering them suitable alternatives as well. Yeah. And then I think the other question was about other sources of pollution, and in particular the one that we have discussed before is around the trains as well. So we know that the train operators have their own air improvement plan in place. There are also regular conversations with Network Rail about the stations and the potential pollution from the stations. And I know that Mark Wollstonecroft I think he's made a presentation to this committee before about what we're seeing from the air quality monitoring around those locations. But a lot of that, which you appreciate as well, Councillor, is predicated on the electrification of the line, and that takes time as well. But there is a commitment from Network Rail and the train operators to improve that. And I think Avanti a couple of years ago announced a major investment in rolling stock that's either electric or hybrid as part of their commitment to improving emissions. And one of the things that would be useful to see as well with the new franchise for the children line, for instance, would be some kind of obligation on the new operator to commit to improving its rolling stock sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor Parker.
Yeah, sorry, just jotted down a couple of things. Not quite as many as that. But it's really interesting, all that, actually. Fascinating. Can I just bounce a few things at you, just on these maybe stupid questions, so we give this. Firstly, how many council vehicles are getting caught by this all the time? Because you hear a lot about the council finding itself effectively, and is there any figures on that? And what is the council? Are there steps being taken to look into that and maybe change the composition of the fleets and so on? And is that part of the revenue spend where it might be able to assist? Are charity vehicles still being charged? Food bank trucks, for example, and things like that, because I work for the local food bank, and I know that was a big thing locally in our area, that food bank vehicles were being charged for this. How much money in pound notes has been raised in total so far? And I'd be interested to know what percentage of that has come from outside Birmingham. It's anecdotally, I hear a lot of people who've got caught by this, who don't live locally, who are aware. I know there are signs up, but there's still a lot of people who wake up and see it, sitting in their posting, and I believe they've been fined because they just missed it. I'm just wondering how that percentage split breaks down. And the final question is on the Clean Air Fund, which you mentioned would potentially go to councillors. I think it was £20,000 a year for 2 years for a single ward. Do you have any idea when that will happen? Is it just likely to be for 2 years? And will there be restrictions on how it can be spent so it fits in with the general aims of this? Yep. So sorry about that.
No, thank you. That's good. Council vehicles. So I'm not responsible for the council.
No, I know.
I have to put that one out there. However, the council has around about roughly 900 vehicles in its overall fleet. The biggest element of that comes from the waste service. They have around about 400 vehicles, 450 vehicles, I think. So that is the biggest chunk. That's not the oldest part of the fleet. There are a range of vehicles that are used. So I don't collect the numbers on the numbers of council vehicles. I know there have been questions raised before in terms of written questions to council and things like that, but I don't collect those numbers, because what we have to do in terms of the operation is think about this as we are absolutely part of the council, but as far as the enforcement process is concerned and the application of the daily fee and that kind of thing, we are almost as independent in terms of, nobody is exempt unless you have an exemption.
So there are fines still.
We've done a lot of work with the waste service to ensure that they are paying the daily fee if they have non-compliant vehicles operating in the clean zone, because they've got the same volume of vehicles. There is also a significant investment program that the waste service have to improve their fleet, not only to being compliant but also to zero emissions. I think I saw something not that long ago actually where they've got their first fully electric waste truck as part of the fleet. But I also know that their first objective is to get compliant vehicles so that they don't have to pay the fee. And part of that is about managing their fleet in a different way, trying to ensure that where they do have compliant vehicles, they're only operating in clean air zone with the compliant vehicles. So there's a range of things that they're doing. So again, I don't know for certain, but I suspect that the volume of vehicles that are subject to the daily fee is reducing over time. In terms of charity vehicles, so there will be vehicles operated by charities that will be subject to the daily fee because they are not compliant. There is not an individual exemption for charities. What we did have was that there were exemptions for commercial vehicles, those sorts of things operating in the clean air zone, and where there were charities that fulfilled some of the requirements of that exemption, we tried to flex the scheme and provide support that way. But the other thing that we've got now as well is with the grants, we're now offering grants for the replacement of vans. Whereas at the beginning of the scheme we weren't doing that, so we're now offering grants up to £4,500 to replace non-compliant vans, whereas previously that was purely focused on HGVs and coaches, but because of the high levels of compliance in that fleet, we're trying to utilise that money for those. And so we'd certainly encourage charities, if they're looking to replace the vehicle, to make contact and where we can provide support in that way. The revenues raised. So for the last financial year, we generated just over £33 million in revenue. 33. That was in line with projections, more or less. As I said before, we put £15 million into reserves to support the projects that already have funds allocated. We put another £2 million in to cover decommissioning costs for the future to reserves. We also put £5 million into reserves to cover operating costs for the future. So at the point at which the levels of compliance are such that the revenues generated from the daily fee don't cover operating costs, because that could happen in the future, we prudently put money into reserves now to cover those future operating costs. So in total, we put into reserves around about £22 million. So the remainder was to cover operating costs for the first year. So that covers staffing costs, IT, money to the government to pay for the central services and things like that.
Yeah.
Oh, and then
sorry. Just about the percentages raised on the outside of outside the IBM, and also the 20%.
So we don't know specifically how much of those revenues are generated by people from a Birmingham postcode or West Midlands or anything like that, because when we get payment data, all we get is an email address. from the payment system. So we don't get a VRM, a registration plate, so we can't track that back, and we don't have the ability to go back into register keeper details because of the way in which the DVLA provides data to us. So we can't go back and personalise it in that way. What I can sort of say is that with the volume of traffic that we get to the website, around about, just check my notes. So what I was saying before was that in the period sort of beginning of June to March of this year, we had around about 3.2 million hits to the website. Around about 66% of those were from outside of Birmingham, West Midlands.
Is that the vehicle reg checker?
Yeah, so that's our website. That's the Brombri's website. So a significant proportion of those then go on to use the vehicle checker. So it is fair to say that a high proportion of people are from outside of Birmingham. Not all of them receive a PCN. The vast majority of people don't get a PCN. The majority of people do pay the day fee. The other question was around the Clean Air Fund in terms of duration and criteria. So the approval that we have from Cabinet is to allocate funds for the next 2 years, because that's where we've got a reasonable degree of certainty in terms of revenues. It's important to remember with the revenues generated from the scheme, they were always predicted to be reducing over time, because as the percentage of non-compliant vehicles reduces, so therefore day fee and so volume from PCNs reduces over time as well. So really, with any degree of certainty, we can only really look at the next couple of financial years, and that's what we've got approval on in terms of providing. In terms of the criteria, yes, there will be criteria against the use of that money. It will need to be aligned back to the legislation we use to create the scheme, so transport-related strategies and policies that help to improve air quality. That's the other part that provides there. So I think there's a couple of ways in which we're looking at it. One is around potentially a menu of options that you would be able to choose from in terms of deliverable projects by local engineers based on itself. The timescale for delivery of those could be at least 12 months based on work and volume and getting permissions and all those sorts of things. The other option that we're exploring is some kind of grant program. So you would be able to bid for the funding against certain criteria and get the money to deliver those projects at a local level. I think one of the things that we have looked at, which I think yourself raised, Councillor Barker, was around EV charging points potentially within communities as a way of trying to make good use of the funding. So yeah, we're trying to explore ways that enable the fund to be used within the constraints of the legislation that we have to work within, but also that enable change to happen relatively quickly as well.
Okay, thank you.
What, any further questions? No.
Sorry, just first of all, do you know any figures in terms of how many fines are unpaid or the cost of pursuit?
So enforcement is handled by the parking services.
Mm-hmm.
So they provide services to me as the head of the Clean Air Zone. So I'm not completely across the terms of data, but at any one particular time, around about 50% of the PCNs that are issued are not paid.
Mm-hmm.
So that sounds like a very high number, but what happens is that as those PCNs get older, the percentage of PCNs that have been paid, depending upon where they are in the process, increases. So those PCNs that were issued in, say, June of last year, the rate of payment is significantly higher than, say, 3 months ago, 6 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way in which it works through the enforcement is a PCN issued. If it's not paid, then a charge certificate will be issued, so it could be recovered at a later point. Yeah. Depending upon where you are in that process, at a particular point, the recovery of that charge is handed over to bailiffs, and at each of those points, the cost of that escalates.
Yeah.
So the standard charge for a PCN is £120. It's reduced to £60 if you pay it within 14 days. If you don't pay that within 28 days, if you don't pay the standard charge within 28 days, it then increases to £180. So that's a charge certificate. If you don't pay the charge certificate, the money just increases.
So that's, sorry, so that's the council's enforcement.
Yeah.
So we don't pay outside organisations in order to.
So at age, so up until, I think at the point at which it gets handed over as a debt recorded with the court, because at that point it's handed over to the bailiffs.
Yeah.
And then they pursue that, that debt. Up until that point, it's internal.
Yeah.
Okay. Right? Okay. You've got to talk about.
Just very quickly. So I noticed in school streets, I think I might have the most in my ward. Might say something about the residents of Bromley can see, but that every single school I've spoken to wants them. The only issue I'm having is enforcement support with them. So already is there any provision for actually supporting schools to implement and maintain them? That's question one. And the other question is simply about air quality monitors. You mentioned phase one is trying to get one in every ward. Are there enough for one in every school? Because I have 11 schools, which is disproportionate, but I would feel disadvantaged if more than one school can have 100% and I can't.
Yeah. So the agreement we've got with the provider is to ensure we get one into every ward, so we will make additional available, despite the fact we've got the debt. In terms of enforcement,
as in what support is being given to schools to actually have a school street?
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay, right. So yeah, so that's a piece of work that's delivered through the travel demand team, which is not part of my team. So there's a number of officers that work on that. They've recently recruited additional staff to support that, because again, that's part of the expansion of the Safe School Streets program. So there's an additional £1 million that's being put into that particular piece of work. I think it would be fair to say that you wouldn't be able to have a safe school street outside every single school, but there is definitely additional resources there to try and support the expansion of that program.
And what can schools do if they're having trouble enforcing it and implementing it?
Yeah, they should definitely be taking it up with the travel demand team. There should be a dedicated point of contact within the travel demand team. Project officers are there to support that.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions for myself, Keith. First of all, your slide on page 13. Some of it could be confusing to members of the public who are familiar with the cleaning of doors. If you look at your slide 13, it's having all the figures seem to be saying one would expect a very desired change in the cleaning door area of the region, because you're restricting non-commuter vehicles. But if you look at the ring road and wider city, the percentage is similar, very similar, given the margin of errors in the statistics. It could be that the things are happening by the on-code rather than affecting what the being affected by the clean air door measures.
Okay, so they do look remarkably similar. And I said this before. However, a lot of that, I think, having gone through the data a couple of times with the monitoring evaluation team, is that you've got the percentage reductions that we're showing here between 2019 to 21 are an average across a number of locations. Yeah? So not all of those locations have gone down. Some of them have gone up. So being completely honest about that. However, the general trend is downwards. As to why they are all remarkably similar, I'm not completely sure, but it is partly down to the way in which the averages work out across a number of locations. So like I said, within the clean air zone, there's 37 monitoring locations. So that 13% reduction is an average across all of those reporting locations, those monitoring locations. For the ring road, I think it's about 15 locations. It might be slightly more than that, but again, it's an average across all of those locations. And again, for the wider city, it's only about 7 locations across the wider city where the data is collected. But again, some of that is also driven by the starting point as well for the data. So those locations outside of the city centre are generally below the legal limit anyway. That's why they've not been included in the clean air zone. The sites on the ring road are just on the periphery of the clean air zone, and the little chart on the right-hand side shows where we continue to have some exceedances. But then those locations within the clean air zone are where we've got the greatest concentration of exceedances. So, yeah,
Well, also, it needs some help. People who look at these figures.
no, I completely understand. But
Okay, secondly, what's not on in your presentation? CPZ, it's controlled parking zones.
Yeah.
Areas like mine, Chili Quarter, where people obviously, if they're approving vehicles, don't bring it to Chili Quarter, they park in regular streets, cutting up regular streets, and obviously polluting the air, making the air worse. So what are we doing with the CPZ?
so there, in addition to the introduction of the clean air zone, there were actually 3 additional measures that we included with the clean air zone. So what we put forward to the government was described as a category D plus clean air zone. So that's the additional measures, because that was the level of change that was believed was modeled to be needed. So those 3 additional measures were the introduction of 2 additional controlled parking zones, like you described. There was the making some changes around Paradise to reduce the volumes of traffic going around there. And then the other one was some changes to the junction at Great Lister Street. So it was not only about trying to reduce some of the traffic that was going through in there, but actually improving the flow of the traffic through that location as well. So that was 2 objectives. For a variety of reasons, all of those schemes have been slightly delayed. But the 2 CPZs are now scheduled for implementation at some point in the new year, based on the latest information I have from the project team on that one. With the changes at Paradise, it's complicated because of everything else that's going on around Paradise. So what we're trying to do is that there is already an interim measure in place that prevents traffic doing a U-turn in that location. So what we're trying to do is make those changes permanent. That is the most important thing based on the proposal that went to the government. So we're working to accelerate that and do that as quickly as possible. So ideally before the end of this calendar year, making those changes permanent. And then with the changes at Great Lister Street, I think the latest timeline I've got for that is, again, early in the new year. One of the things we've been trying to do there is really look at the proposal, because time has moved on from when it was originally submitted to the government, and think about additional measures that could be put in place to support cycling in that area. Because again, that's absolutely part and parcel of what we're trying to do here, is encourage that mode shift. So we are doing that. I think it's important to remember that the 2 additional CPZs are also encompassed in a general review of parking within the boundary of the clean air zone, looking at all of the CPZs, looking to try and rationalise the pricing regimes and the support provided across all of those. So there was a much more holistic view of those. And at the same time, there is a review of parking around the boundary of the clean air zone as well, just to try and reduce the risk of people parking just on the outside and then walking inside, because that will be of concern to residents and for anybody who's got a wall in those areas as well. So the timescales for that review are at least 12 months in terms of capturing the data, because it involves NPR surveys, local consultations, all those sorts of things. But local board members will be absolutely involved in that process as well, because that's absolutely critical. But yeah, so that's how we're trying to see those things holistically, because we're also conscious of, this is something I talked about with the clean air zone, is that you take one action in one place to address one particular problem, then you've got knock-on consequences. So what we're just trying to do with all of these things is think about those potential knock-ons and then manage those in as efficient a way as possible.
Okay. The other question is what I don't really love Dr. Ruby, it's pretty low. Is the putting conflicts to parking question? It's for the PCN enforcement. It's not only somebody traveling to Birmingham, it's in some areas who are not familiar with how the charging works, and unintentionally or lack of information, they find out with the PCNs, and they end up with 160, 121 fine per PTN, which is not paid within 20 to 180, then go to bailiffs. Could you tell us what is the justification of from 81 charge going to say 60 or 120 pound, 180 pound bailiffs? I accept, I'm not getting the legal person here. You could argue that we have not, it's not our policy, we are following the national policy. Fine. But if that policy not built for purpose, it's bringing injustice on fairness to the railers. It's bad law, it's bad process, and something got done about it. No, any penalty process needs to be fair, transparent, and where people understand. But all clean air zone PTNs are mystery. It could be, or some people are not properly informed. Honest they are, they're very intelligent, they're IT literate, they can be all the sources. Every person, like somebody on normally was the first person, if you ask them, they will go, no, they live in Birmingham. So what could be done to make our process fairer? So that they don't end up with criminal records or end up in big debts. I mean, they go, if somebody, makes it first of all, I know you say you probably with all signs are compliant, but it didn't say you have 13-day window. Either you can pay 6 days before or the same day or travel 6 days after. It didn't always say that on the sign. It didn't say how to pay. All the signs say, except that you will argue it's illegally compliant, right? But it didn't give information when to pay, what the window is, and how to pay, right? And process would be like Dartford Tunnel. They have auto pay system. Somebody come to Birmingham regularly, or they can register their vehicle, and then they don't have to end up with the PCNs, because when they have the travel, they can't be deducted by it. So why can't you have that come?
So I think the first thing I need to say is that ultimately the policy setting around the enforcement process, which is responsibility of Kevin Hicks, is very high. And I know he visits the committee regularly and provides updates on a range of issues as well. So that's the first thing to say. Okay. So the second thing is that the policy around the enforcement process is defined by legislation. The council's policy is to follow the legislation as it's written. So we're not creating a policy, but it's the legislation says. The legislation also defines the information that you include on a PCN. It defines the response times in terms of 28 days to pay the standard charge, 56 days within a period notice of rejection of representation can be reviewed. Sorry, representation can be reviewed. Notice of rejection of representation or uphold an appeal. It also stipulates the additional rights of appeal that a driver has in terms of going to the Traffic Penalty Tribunal, Traffic Enforcement Centre. So there are multiple rights of appeal throughout the process. Okay? So just to be absolutely clear, we do not define the enforcement process. It is defined by legislation. All councils that issue penalty charge notices follow that legislation. What differs from council to council is how they may interpret some of those elements of the legislation. Like I said, our policy is to follow the legislation as it's written. So that's how that works. I think the other thing just to reflect on within this is that every effort is made to encourage drivers to alert drivers to the fact that the zone operates. There are over 300 signs in place. I absolutely accept that not everybody will see those signs. I've driven into other cities before and missed road signs because you do. That is the way it works. However, there are 300 signs in place. There are the blue informational signs in advance of the boundary of the clean air zone, and they start about 2 miles out, and they say 2 miles ahead is a clean air zone. 1 mile ahead is a clean air zone. On the boundary of the clean air zone, you're entering the clean air zone. To your point about the information that's on those signs, that's a difficult one. So the information that's within the design of those schemes is set out by the Department for Transport. They provide a signing scheme that all authorities, and you are always limited by how much information you can put on those signs. If you contrast the information that London has on its informational signs for the ULEZ versus what we've got, it doesn't say at all times. It just says at all times, and it just says ULEZ. So there are a number of people that don't see ULEZ signs and they don't appreciate it. And I've been speaking to somebody who works here about something else to do with the signs, and I said it's very, very similar to the London ULEZ, and they said, what's that? So some of this is about just general awareness in general. But like I said, we absolutely accept that not everybody knows about the scheme, not everybody sees the signs. That's why we do the additional marketing. That's why we do the additional campaigns to try and provide that information in a slightly different way, to provide that additional information. And it was absolutely critical to us to try and provide that additional coverage, that additional campaign during the period of the Commonwealth Games. When we had we were expecting a significant number of people from outside of the city to come in. That's why we had the posters in the car parks. That's why we had the advertising on ways and all those sorts of things. So those are all the things that we do to try and do that. In terms of contrasting something like the dart charge, yes, they do have an auto pay system, but you only know about the auto pay system if you know there's a dart charge and you register for it. If you drive through the dart charge and you don't pay within, I think it's 24 hours, like 2 days, you're sent to PCN. You've got 13 days to pay the CAS day fee, 6 days before the day of travel, 6 days after. And with other schemes as well, their payment windows are different. Some are shorter, some are less, some worse. But again, it's all based around the individual demands of the scheme and what they're trying to do and all those sorts of things. We do provide feedback from people who use the systems in terms of the payment process and things like that. We feed that back to the DVLA in terms of the payment portal. We are looking at the feedback we receive from drivers around the signage and things like that, looking at providing that feedback back to the DFT to see if there are improvements in the signage scheme that can be made to help maybe add additional information, just because, again, if there are improvements that can be made to some of this, then we absolutely will. But the majority of people who do need to pay the day fee do pay the day fee. I think that's important as well. But the council has gone on the record before to say that if we were to generate no revenues from the scheme, we would be quite happy with that position, because it would mean that 100% of the vehicles entering the scheme are compliant, and that's something it's about. So this is absolutely not about revenue generation in any way, shape, or form.
I accept that, but again, if there's a private parking company, we have to have the whole, they were British canvas. They were painting or putting signs on very little signs and getting people, trapping people. And then the public outcry, there's for get over legislation. And we went, so if someone came legally, if in a way, a legal way, I think it is in a way similar to some. It is being felt by some people who feel that they have been caught, unexpectedly. So I think either if we can, we need to find a way of making our system more transparent, more fairer to all CAS users, so that we don't have people who get penalised.
Absolutely, but I think you've just got to be very cautious about comparing the operation of this scheme to, say, somebody with a parking scheme scenario you were suggesting. From what you were describing, it sounds like they're deliberately trying to entrap somebody.
You do get the impression, anecdotally, that it's catching people out. Actually, a lot of people don't know it outside the area. I suppose a lot of people don't live in Birmingham, and it gives a bad impression of Birmingham because they leave the city on the weekend and then find out they're being fined. Sure. And the sign don't actually say anything about how you pay or where you pay. Normally, you go to a car park, you've got opportunities to pay on the spot, haven't you? So you can quite easily whiz past them like that. So I do think it's penalising a lot of people. Probably would have paid if they'd be more aware of it, particularly from outside the area. And that's why I asked about the percentage match of getting trapped, because I feel that, and it doesn't leave a great impression of the city when people can visit, in my opinion, in my experience.
I completely understand that, and I completely understand, you know, the dismay of somebody who receives a PC in the post after visiting the city. That's the last thing we would like. But again, there are over 300 signs in place. And by the same token, you won't hear from the people who have seen the signs and have paid the fee. And the vast majority of people do.
Steve, agree from us, I think, for myself and the person, that there are some people who feel that we obviously will not fair, so can we make it try to make fair? Okay, that's conclude this item then. Okay, thanks, Steve. Next one, and we move on to work program.
Yes, so this, you'll see this in your pack between pages 13 and 24. So I want to reiterate, this is a live document. So it's as it was a couple of weeks ago when it sent out to you. So there has been a few changes that I want to just update you on. Draw your attention to page 24 of your pack. Sorry, let me double check. I'm looking at the right page. I'm looking at the final page of the work programme report. And this is where you will see the items to be scheduled. So to update you that our November meeting has now got 2 items from that to be scheduled list, which is around the re-procurement of the highways PFI and the street work permit scheme. Those 2 items will be have been scheduled in for November. Through the chair and further, we're just asking one of the items, which is the City of Nature. We'd like to request whether that could come in for your October meeting alongside the Cabinet member. And then of the remaining items, there was a question from us in terms of, is there any priorities you would like us to go back to the office and say we'd like that before that? So if there is any feedback from committee, that would be really helpful. Subject, obviously, when we're discussing it with the officers, they may indicate a certain time when it would be better to have an item because, for example, the development of the road safety strategy, there might be a better slot for you to input on that than so. And the final bit is there anything missing? Is there anything further to conversations today or subsequent between the last that you feel hasn't been added to that list, which should be? Oh yes, sorry, and there's one more that Stephen's just reminded me on. The March meeting, we have scheduled the flooding report, which I understand is a regular item for the March. So there's a couple of amendments, but questions for you now is City of Nature for October, whether or not you would be supportive of that. Is there anything missing you would like to see that we can work with officers to add to the scheduled list? And finally, is there anything in terms of the remaining items in terms of priorities?
Members? Yes.
Thank you. I noticed from the forward plan that the footway crossings policy is due to go to Cabinet in October. This is on page 15 and 24. If highways are coming to us about the street works permit scheme, it would seem sensible that we could raise that issue at exactly the same time, given that a decision will have been made at Cabinet. I raised this with the work programme the last meeting. I see it's still on the work programme that the very top of page 15 and 24, the capital bid for the introduction of car parking across selected BCC parks, except that the Cabinet report got nothing to do with the introduction of car parking, but had everything to do with the introduction of car parking charges. And I emphasise the fact that the title is completely misleading, because there's a significant difference between the introduction of car parking across BCC parks and the introduction of car parking charging across selected BCC parks.
Potentially something we could explore for the future, but it would be separate to the calling that is taking place on Monday.
Can you request? Can I ask that as it's topic that's very controversial, particularly in St Coldfield, where charges are planning to introduce, and no doubt other places too.
Do you agree with us?
Shall we, I think the first thing to be clear on is what would be the purpose and what you'd like to achieve with the item. And I think that because it's kind of like a cross-committee issue, that might then indicate whether this is will fall under the remit of this this committee.
Thank you, Chair. Steve has already talked about the displacement effect in terms of the clean air zone and the potential for CP sets because of neighbourhoods just outside the zone suddenly acting as a massive car park for. And I think one of the issues that I'm concerned about is that if you introduce car parking charges in selected DCC parks, the City Council highways network around the parks suddenly become de facto car parks. And as I understand it, the highways network comes fully within the remit of this committee. And it's the displacement effect that we need to look into. So not the policy per se, but it's the impact and displacement effect of the policy on an issue within the remit of this committee.
Yeah, because that was the thing. Do you want it at this stage when it's a policy, or would you like it at a later stage after implementation to see that impact? That would be all both.
Well, at the end of the day, we've got to wait for the calling decision. And if it is called in, then it goes back to Cabinet for them to re-examine. I think it would be precipitous to do it before we know the outcome of the calling and if necessary the outcome of the revised Cabinet decision.
Therefore, through the chair, in light of that, would it be more effective to have a conversation on that at the end of the work programme at the next committee, so we can make a decision exactly what we want and when, following the calling on.
Yes, sometimes we may have to invite Kevin Hicks. I think comes everything.
I was going to suggest, because we've got Kevin coming in, and then the decision would have been made by then. And decision might make sense to be.
Yes,
Yes.
charging to one side,
Yes.
but the impact of displacement parking
Yes.
is still going to be issue. So
Yes.
we can discuss any time. Okay?
Yeah.
So that will be.
Yeah,
that will be
nothing to do
done.
with the calling.
No, so forget about the calling,
Yes.
but it's issue we can take up with Kevin Hicks. Okay, November.
November's gone to being a very busy meeting.
No, but I think we can move something to the end of give it Friday.
Yeah.
Okay? Right. Let's start.
Yes, done. Thank
Right.
you very much.
Next is the date and our next meeting. That's 19th of October, 2 p.m. Any press recording? Any citizens?
Not yet.
Any other business? No being none. Party to change and obviously draft. Great. Okay, thank you very much. That's the food of.
Thank you. Thank you. I've got plenty of them.
You.
Yeah, just double check.